pastor I've ever met. I believe he's here. Pastor Jackson Lawmeyer.
Thank you, Clay. Well, good evening, everybody. My fellow conspiracy theorists, we're glad you're here tonight, and it's good to see you. And you can be seated. I'm not the star of the show tonight. I'm just hosting, but we are glad to have you here, and I want to welcome you. As Clay said, my name is Jackson Lawmeyer. I have the privilege of pastoring Sheridan.Church here, but I also have the privilege of serving as the head of Pastors for Trump, and can I tell you, we're working very hard to win an election in 2024. Are you ready for Donald Trump back in the Oval Office? Good. We'll let him. I think he's going to do pretty well in Oklahoma. But tonight we have a special guest with us who's become a very good friend of mine, somebody that has helped me a lot on the journey that I have been on. I didn't really choose to become political. It kind of chose me, and I kind of got thrown into it, but I've had some great people that I've been able to look up to and speak into my life. And so tonight we're going to talk about something that happened 60 years ago. And some people say, well, why are you talking about something from 60 years ago? Well, because the same thing that was happening then is still around today. You know, there's actually nothing new under the sun. And so we've got a video to play, and I'd like just for you to turn your attention to the screen real quickly.
Richard Nixon.
Well, I'm not a crook.
Ronald Reagan.
Tear down this wall.
And Donald Trump.
And a friend of mine for a long time, he only likes politics. If you ask him about how are the Yankees doing, he has no interest. If you ask him almost anything, he likes politics, and he's a professional at the highest level. Roger Stone.
All of these presidents relied on one man to secure their seat in the Oval Office. That man is Roger Stone.
Stand to your feet, and will you welcome Mr. Roger Stone to Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Thank you very much.
Good to have you here.
Great to be here.
All right. Oh, yeah, he is an American hero that has gone to bat for our country. And Roger, we're glad you're here. You can take a seat. We're going to have a discussion tonight. And just so everybody is aware, we will be doing a live Q&A. And you can ask Roger anything you want to ask. And we'll see whatever you want to say towards it. But before we get started, we're going to talk about a book you've written. We're going to talk about what has happened over the last 60 years. But I'm going to ask a question that I know everybody is wondering. With all that you've gone through, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. My wife, as I think some of you know, after the 2-year ordeal of being hunted and pressured by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, who charged me with non-existent crimes, basically fabricated crimes, in an effort to pressure me to testify falsely against my friend of 45 years, Donald Trump. I got to a very dark place. I was depressed, I was angry, I was despondent, I had a feeling of helplessness. And then a very young pastor, Randy Coggins, who I'd met in North Florida, contacted me to tell me that Reverend Franklin Graham was going to be in the area of Florida where I live, in Boca Raton. As a much younger man, when I was working for Richard Nixon, I had the opportunity to actually meet the great Billy Graham, drove him in a golf cart from the Hilton Hotel in Key Biscayne to President Nixon's compound in Key Biscayne. And I still have to this day the Bible that Billy Graham signed for me. So I jumped at the opportunity to meet Franklin Graham. And I poured my heart out to him. He gave me about 20 minutes. He was very kind. And I was thinking like a politician, like a political operative. And I said, Reverend Graham, maybe you could put a good word in for me with the president, since my lawyers won't let me speak to him, and his lawyers won't let him speak to me. And he said, well, I'll see what I can do, but let me give you a much better piece of advice. Turn your burden over to the Lord. Confess your sins, get right with Jesus, pledge to walk in his way, And I can just tell you, the Lord will lift you up. The Lord will deliver you from your persecutors. And I thought about that for a few moments. And then we went to a revival that he had just steps away. And he had reserved seats for myself and Pastor Coggins, who was with me. And he's not his father. He's different than his father. But he's equally dynamic. He's a great speaker. He's a great apostle for the Lord. And he came to the part of his oration where he said, I don't care whether your problems are alcohol addiction or drug addiction or health problems or family problems or relation problems or financial problems, you need to turn your life over to the Lord. So those who want to live with our Heavenly Father for all eternity, stand up now, confess your sins, and pledge to walk in his way. And at that moment, as natural as can be, without being ashamed or embarrassed, without a moment of hesitation, I stood in this open field with 300 other Christians. I confessed my sins, and my life changed dramatically from that moment.
Praise God.
Now, I know that folks at the New York Times and the Washington Post and other media elites mock me for that. They think it's some kind of act or some kind of pose or some kind of head fake. I'll be quite honest with you. I don't really care what they think. I really care what he thinks. You can't fool God. You can't play games with God. Look, I'm a sinner, as we all are. I don't claim to be any kind of a saint or a savior or anything special other than a simple soldier in the army of God.
Amen. Amen.
Shortly after the Lord answered my prayers and President Donald Trump, seeing that I was being subjected to a completely politically motivated criminal indictment in the District of Columbia, where I was put through a Soviet-style show trial, where very similar to what's happening to Donald Trump, I wasn't allowed to mount any of the defenses that I thought I should be allowed to mount. In other words, the underlying premise of the charges against me said that the Democratic National Committee had been subjected to an online hack by Russian intelligence, but the judge would not let me use expert testimony or forensic evidence to prove that literally not only never happened, but the government has no evidence to the contrary. But after the pardon, my wife of 37 years, who had been my rock through this entire trial, who in those moments of doubt and pain that I had, bucked me up and told me to keep the faith, to keep faith in the Lord. She was diagnosed with extremely aggressive stage 4 cancer. I've talked about it here before at Sheridan.Church, and it has been a struggle, but I'm happy to tell you tonight, through the healing power of Jesus Christ, she's now 2.5 years cancer-free.
Amen.
Which proves that Jesus Christ can do anything.
Amen.
So to answer your question directly, the attacks continue. One of the most dangerous things out there is artificial intelligence. They can put words in your mouth of things that you never said. Get ready for a wave of it. You're going to see it constantly now. They will never stop attacking me because I will never stop fighting for the country.
Which brings up another question before we get into the topic of the night. How is President Trump doing with the last 8 months being so chaotic?
As I said earlier, I've known him for 45 years. He doesn't like it when I say that because he says it makes both of us sound old. But I must tell you, for a man who has this level of stress and the extraordinary attacks on him, they're trying to lock him up for 600 years if he were to be convicted on all of the outstanding 91 charges against him. He's amazingly calm. He's amazingly resilient. He's amazingly determined. He is amazingly optimistic about victory, extraordinarily confident. He's lost about 20 pounds. He looks better than he's looked in years. His mood is really excellent. That's because Donald Trump is a brawler. He is a fighter. This has nothing to do with him. If it had to do with Trump, he would just retire to a great life of playing golf and counting money. And I don't believe that they would be trying to destroy his life or trying to lock him up. He is running for one reason and one reason only. He loves this country and he hates seeing what's being done to it. It's that simple.
Yeah. So we'll transition to why you're here tonight. You've written a book, and it's out in the lobby, and I would encourage everybody to grab this book. In fact, you're going to sign every book that is purchased tonight as well afterwards. But what got you intrigued? What kind of led you on the journey to write a book about who really killed John F. Kennedy? Because I know the most recent polling out there shows around 70% of Americans today do not believe the official narrative of the Warren Commission. In fact, we'll take a poll right now. Who in here does not believe the Warren Commission? Just let me, so it's like 100% here, but it's overall 70%.
The Gallup poll continues to show that north of 60% of the people don't believe the official narrative, which is that Lee Harvey Oswald, a disgruntled Russian communist, acting alone, firing only 3 shots from behind, killed John F. Kennedy. And that's despite the fact that the mainstream media has pushed and pushed and pushed this narrative and has sought over time to silence anyone who dared to challenge the official narrative. What got me interested in this subject overall, in 1964, when I was 12 years old, I first had my initial interest in politics. A woman who was a next door neighbor where we lived in Connecticut was very active in the Women's Republican Club, and she gave me a book called Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater. And I read this book and I was immediately transfixed, because what Barry believed in is what I believed in: a strong national defense, low taxes, less regulation, peace through strength, privacy, a constitution-based government. Now, before that, prior to reading that book, I wanted to be an actor. Now I figured out that politics was show business for ugly people. And I became a Goldwater volunteer. I had a Goldwater sticker on my bicycle. I wore a Goldwater button to school. I wore the button 3 weeks after Barry lost. I was, but when you're 12 years old, you're not that cognizant of the realities. But I read a book called A Texan Looks at Lyndon by J. Evetts Haley, which outlined how epically corrupt Lyndon Johnson was. He was a lifelong segregationist, despite his late conversion to be the civil rights president. He was embroiled in massive scandals. So I already had an underlying distaste for Johnson. The Johnson law, which prevents you from talking politics in a church, was passed when he was in the Senate so that pastors in Texas could not criticize him when he was running for re-election, for example. So I had this underlying distrust of him, and I had a pretty good fix on his moral character. But I would come later, having worked for Richard Nixon in 1968, but not really, and again in 1972, I was the youngest member of his campaign staff. But I really didn't get to have an intimate relationship with him, a close relationship with him, until his post-presidential years when I was in New York and he was living in New York. And Nixon was a man who was always very forward-looking. It was very hard to get him to be retrospective. it was very hard to get him to talk about the great events of his life, Dwight Eisenhower, Joe McCarthy, the being attacked by a communist mob in Caracas, the Nixon-Kennedy debates, his relationship with John Kennedy, which was surprisingly complex, except for when he had a few drinks. And Nixon was very, very proud of his martini-making skills. He referred to them as silver bullets. And here's his recipe very quickly. Take a bottle of olives, you drain the juice. You fill it with water, you put the cap back on, you shake it vigorously, you drain the water. Now you fill the jar with dry vermouth and you put it in the refrigerator. You have beforehand taken 2 martini glasses, splash them with water and put them in the freezer. Now you take a cocktail shaker and you put a combination of cracked ice and cubed ice in the cocktail shaker. It must be cracked and you shake it very, very, very vigorously. And he would say, now when you pour it, if there are not tiny shards of ice on the surface of the martini, well, that means you effed it up. You then pour your martini into the chilled glass. You take one of the pre-marinated olives and you drop it into the martini. And I had my first one. I said, Mr. President, this is amazing. He said, yeah, I got the recipe from Winston Churchill. So it was on one of these occasions in which I was sitting with him. This was actually at his home in Saddle River, New Jersey. And we'd had a couple drinks. And he did get pretty loquacious after he'd had a cocktail or two. And I said, Mr. President, can I ask you a question? He said, sure. I said, who really killed John Kennedy? And he kind of stared into his glass and he said, well, the Warren Commission was the biggest goddamn hoax in American history. I said, I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand. And he kind of shivered and he said, let me put it to you this way. Lyndon and I both wanted to be president, but the difference was I wouldn't kill for it. And to me, that kind of told me what it was I wanted to know. And that is really what ultimately inspired me to do the research, to write this book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. I took it to 7 different publishers, all of whom told me that there would be no public interest whatsoever in this book, that nobody would ever buy it. I found a publisher who would publish it. Initially, it had a press run of 5,000 books. It sold out like that, but it's a good thing because it had so many typographical errors in it that it gave us an opportunity to correct them. The next printing was 25,000. That also sold out relatively quickly. Then we printed another 50,000, and it has been actively in print since then. You do not want the hardback edition because the paperback edition not only has a much cooler cover that I designed myself, but more importantly, it has 3 additional chapters of things that I learned after I published the initial book, because I found that when you write a book like this, that's this controversial, that people contact you with information that you didn't have before, and then you have to be diligent about vetting it, confirming it, and I wrote 3 extra chapters that are at the end of the book. What I concluded was that John F. Kennedy, who I have revised my view of, I mean, as a Nixon man, obviously I wrote 2 books on Nixon about Watergate, essentially, about the Nixon presidency, and I did conclude that with the help of Lyndon Johnson, the 1960 election was indeed stolen from Richard Nixon. There was a very long, very detailed examination and documentation of that in the New York Herald Tribune, which cannot be found online. I had to dig around in the basement in a warehouse in New York where those records were kept on microfiche. But my view of Kennedy has now changed very dramatically. First of all, John Kennedy was an ardent anti-communist. Yes. Secondarily, he favored a massive defense buildup for America in the face of the communist threat. He favored a silver-backed dollar. He also had a deep distrust of our intelligence agencies because essentially they had lied to him about the Bay of Pigs invasion, and they had lied to him about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let me stop there for a moment and explain that. The Cuban Missile Crisis is glamorized today, and we're told, there's a movie about this, that John and Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and John Kennedy's closest advisor, faced down the Soviet dictator Nikita Khrushchev and forced him to remove his missiles that had been planted 90 miles off our shore in communist Cuba. What they didn't tell us, but which we now know from declassified documents, what the military and the intelligence agencies knew at the time was that the Kennedys made a secret deal with Khrushchev to remove our missiles, our NATO missiles, from Turkey and Italy and Greece, changing the balance of power in the European theater. That was classified information for 40 years. It got him the deep distrust of the intelligence agencies and the Pentagon. In the case of the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Bay of Pigs invasion was planned under Dwight Eisenhower in a working group headed by Vice President Richard Nixon. It was a top secret. At the 1960 debate, the Central Intelligence Agency had briefed both Nixon and Kennedy about the invasion with the understanding that neither one of them would discuss it publicly. In the debate, to Richard Nixon's surprise, John Kennedy came at him not from the left but from the right, saying that the Eisenhower administration, of which Nixon was a part, was not doing enough to dislodge the communist threat 90 miles from our shore. And of course, Nixon could say nothing. So this bred the deep distrust of Richard Nixon for the Central Intelligence Agency. We'll come back to that later. But in the case of Kennedy, he approved a plan that included air support for the men who were storming the beaches, who were Cuban exiles, and the entire point of the plan was plausible deniability. In other words, this was supposed to look like an indigenous Cuban uprising, and there were supposed to be 29 Panamanian flagged bombers flown by Cuban pilots flown out of Panama to provide air cover for the men storming the beaches. Unbeknownst to President Kennedy, Charles Cable, the number 2 man at the CIA, who just happened to be the brother of Dallas Mayor Earl Cable, a close associate and crony of Lyndon Johnson, canceled that air power, and as the men stormed the beach and were being cut to ribbons by Fidel Castro's sharpshooters, the Joint Chiefs, including Curtis LeMay, went to John Kennedy and said, the only way to save the day is to send in the U.S. Air Force. Kennedy refused, saying the whole precept of this plan was for it not to look like a U.S. invasion. And Kennedy famously said over this that he would smash the CIA into a million pieces and scatter them to the wind. So this explains the animus between the Central Intelligence Agency and John Kennedy. What I determined in my research is that there was, in fact, a domestic conspiracy, I hate that word, to murder John F. Kennedy, and that there were many institutions and individuals involved, all of whom had a different motive. I've just told you the motive of the Central Intelligence Agency, who thought that Kennedy was soft on the Russians. They wanted to use Cuba to spark a war with the Russians. The Secret Service, the FBI, and the Central Intelligence Agency also became aware of the fact that President John F. Kennedy had become addicted to methamphetamine. He was being treated by a doctor named Dr. Max Jacobson in New York, who was treating all the beautiful people of the day, Aristotle Onassis, Frank Sinatra, Maria Calais, the opera singer, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, Pablo Picasso, Leonard Bernstein, the famous conductor, telling them all that what he was giving them was a proprietary blend of vitamins and enzymes. And Kennedy was seeing Jacobson because of the horrific pain in his back. John Kennedy was an absolute World War II hero whose PT boat had been cut in half and who had swum for hours dragging a wounded colleague by a rope in his teeth and had badly injured his back in that incident. So they knew that Kennedy was taking these treatments, and of course they used it to rationalize his murder. My God, the man's a drug addict. He could give away the store to Nikita Khrushchev. If you look at the manifest, the official document that tells you who was on the plane to Vienna for the summit with Nikita Khrushchev, you will find the name of Dr. Max Jacobson. There's a terrific book on this entitled Dr. Feelgood. Organized crime had a grudge against John F. Kennedy because John Kennedy's father, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, who was a bootlegger and a partner of Frank Costello's in that illegal industry, had gone to the mob in 1959, late 1959, had gone to a conclave of all the mafia chieftains, which was called in Chicago by Sam Giancana, who headed the mob in Chicago, and all the family members were there. Santo Trafficante, the head of the mob in Florida, Carlos Marcello, who headed the mob in Texas and Louisiana, Frank Costello, who headed the mob in New York, Camel Humphreys, who headed the mob in Las Vegas, Mickey Cohn, who headed the mob in Los Angeles, and Ambassador Kennedy, who was a brash individual to say the least, said, "My son is going to be president. I'm not leaving here without $1 million, which in 1959 is an enormous amount of money." And Humphreys of Las Vegas and Mickey Cohn of LA got up and said, "You can go to hell. We own Dick Nixon. We've been contributing to him since his career began." And they left. Giancana got a broad agreement, and $1 million went to the Kennedy campaign. But more precisely, Ambassador Kennedy agreed that under the Kennedy administration, under a new Justice Department, the deportation proceedings against Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, two of the most vicious gangsters of the time, would be dropped. The Eisenhower administration, under Attorney General Herbert Brownell, was seeking to deport both of them, and a deal was made. Of course, later, when Robert Kennedy became Attorney General, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy initially sat aside while Robert Kennedy proceeded in those deportation hearings. And Giancana went back to Ambassador Kennedy and said, "We had a deal." And Ambassador Kennedy said, "Well, the deal's changed. You guys own the Cal Neva Casino in Reno, Nevada, and I want a 50% interest in that property. And when I get that, well, then the deportation proceedings against Marcello and Trafficante will be dropped."
So they crossed the mob.
He double-crossed the mob. However, shortly thereafter, Ambassador Kennedy was felled by a debilitating stroke. He lost the ability to speak. He essentially became an invalid. He was no longer able to enforce the deal. By the way, the interest in the casino was transferred to Morton Downey Sr., who was a famous Irish tenor and crony of Ambassador Joseph B. Kennedy. So the mob was double-crossed, and that is their motive. More importantly, the mob also agreed to twist arms for John Kennedy, first in the West Virginia primary, and then in the general election in the state of Texas, as well as the state of Illinois, and they felt entirely and completely double-crossed. That's their motive. The banks, the Wall Street interests, were opposed to the silver-backed dollar that Kennedy was insisting on. That was their motive. The Texas oil boys were upset about Kennedy's announced plan to do away with the oil depletion allowance, which would have cost the Texas oil men like H.L. Hunt and Clint Murchison and others millions and millions of dollars of additional taxes. That was their motive. So what's key to understand here is that the man with the most acute motive is Lyndon Johnson himself. So I will tell you in a moment how he has a unique relationship with each one of the others in this conspiracy. But Lyndon Johnson was under investigation in two of the biggest scandals in American political history, the Bobby Baker scandal. Baker was the sergeant at arms at the U.S. Senate. He was Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man. He was also his bag man. No major appropriation, particularly defense appropriations, passed the Senate in the 1950s without a payoff to LBJ. That was under active investigation by Senator John J. Williams, who was considered the conscience of the Senate. And then there was the Billy Sol Estes scandal. Billy Sol Estes was a flamboyant Texas wheeler dealer, and he had received multi-million-dollar agricultural contracts from the federal government at the behest of Lyndon Johnson, was kicking back to Johnson. So Johnson knew that these investigations were afoot. The Senate hearings into Bobby Baker actually opened on November 22nd, 1963. And therefore, Johnson had heard that Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, had already begun telling people Johnson would be dropped from the 1964 ticket, he would be prosecuted, and he was headed to prison. In fact, Drew Pearson, who was at that time the most influential syndicated columnist of his day, had a column already written that was supposed to publish on November 23rd, 1963, the day after the assassination, in which he accused Johnson of taking a massive bribe in return for delivering a defense contract to General Dynamics. So Lyndon Johnson was the man staring into the abyss. It was kill or be killed from his point of view.
So you have Texas Oil, CIA, the mob, and then Wall Street along with Lyndon Johnson. And so the question then becomes, how does this all kind of come together, and then why Dallas, why that particular place, and who did it?
Well, Johnson has a unique relationship with everybody involved. So as the majority leader of the Senate, Johnson takes the unusual step of appointing himself to the subcommittee of defense appropriations, where the secret black box budgets for the CIA are maintained, and he's the paymaster for the CIA. The CIA has massive growth in their budget through the 1950s. Additionally, Lyndon Johnson's next-door neighbor was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover knew that in 1964 he hit the mandatory retirement age, and the Kennedys intended to put him out to pasture. That mandatory retirement could only be waived by the President of the United States. Lyndon Johnson's daughters both referred to J. Edgar Hoover as Uncle Edgar. They had a very close relationship because Johnson had tripled the FBI budget in the 50s. As far as the mob was concerned, Johnson was taking payoffs from Carlos Marcello to protect his illegal gambling operations in Dallas and Houston and San Antonio. The bagman there was a man named Jack Halfer. Halfer would later be convicted of a minor crime. It's amazing. He got a full presidential pardon on November 23rd, 1963. The banks made it known to Johnson they were opposed to a silver-backed dollar. Kennedy was also fighting with the state of Israel. Israel was demanding to have nuclear weapons. Kennedy was opposed to their having nuclear weapons. After the murder of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson agreed to Israel's having the nuclear bomb. Another factor in all of this. So Johnson, I argue, has a unique relationship with each one of them. Now, John Kennedy goes to Dallas at the behest of Lyndon Johnson, who convinces him that there's a deep schism in the Texas Democratic Party between the progressive wing headed by Senator Ralph Yarborough, an arch enemy of LBJ's, and Texas Governor John Connally, who would later become a Republican and serve as Secretary of the Treasury in the Nixon administration. The man who, by the way, convinced Richard Nixon to take America off the gold standard. But that's another story for another day. The idea here was for Kennedy to be seen with Connally and Yarborough to bind up the divisions in the Democratic Party. But Kennedy, who stayed in Fort Worth the night before, was supposed to drive from the airport to the Merchandise Mart, both of whom were outside the city of Dallas. So the purposes of going into downtown Dallas to drive outside of downtown Dallas never made any sense. It was Connally, according to the book of Jerry Bruno, who was the chief advance man for John F. Kennedy, who demanded the route through Dealey Plaza. In Dealey Plaza, they violate numerous Secret Service protocols. At no time is the presidential limousine supposed to come to a full stop. It does. The buildings on both sides of the street are supposed to be emptied, searched, and sealed. They most definitely weren't. There's supposed to be Secret Service agents in plain clothes in the crowd. There are not. There's supposed to be 6 motorcycle officers, 3 abreast on either side of the presidential limousine. There's 1 motorcycle officer. He's told to ride behind the presidential limousine. We know that the Secret Service manual was obtained by Lyndon Johnson early in the first term. Was given to Johnson's personal attorney, Ed Clark, who Barr McClellan, who was in the same law firm, wrote a terrific book making the case that Clark is the man who planned the Kennedy assassination. Now, so we established that it was Johnson who insisted on the route. Just within the last several weeks, you've had 2 bombshell revelations. One, a retired Secret Service agent named Paul Landis, who's 88 years old, came forward to say that he actually found a bullet lodged in the back seat of the presidential limousine before it was hosed out, by the way, before it could be inspected. And he took it into Parkland Hospital and put it on the stretcher next to John Kennedy. This essentially shatters the theory that Kennedy was hit strictly from behind by 3 bullets, all shot from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. A nurse who's still alive, Phyllis Hill, has also come forward to say that she saw Landis place the bullet there. The same bullet later shows up on Connally's stretcher, and it is alleged that it is the bullet that went through John Kennedy, hit Connally, and lodged first in Connally's wrist, and then ultimately in his thigh, and allegedly was found on the stretcher. The bullet, by the way, is pristine. It does not appear to have been fired at all. So also shocking, and this was covered by the New York Times. This is got very wide publicity recently. And then Paramount Pictures recently produced a documentary by the Parkland doctors, almost all of whom are still alive, interestingly enough, did involve some testimony from 2 of them who are deceased, but all of them say that in Parkland Hospital, they saw bullet wounds in John Kennedy that were consistent with his being shot from both the front and the back. Several of them testified that the bullet wound in his throat, which we are told is an exit wound from the rear, was actually an entry wound from the front. But the doctors at Parkland conduct a tracheotomy, so by the time John Kennedy's body gets to Bethesda, you can't determine whether that wound was an entry wound or an exit wound. They also all record a blowout wound about the size of a grapefruit in the back of John Kennedy's head. That is consistent with being shot from the front. You're all familiar, I think, with the famous Zapruder film. Abraham Zapruder was just a private citizen, had a movie camera, was filming, actually caught the shots that hit John Kennedy. Only one journalist was allowed to see that before they were locked away for 50 years. And that is Dan Rather of CBS, who says at the time that Kennedy's head snapped violently forward. We've now seen the film. His head snaps violently back into the left, back into the left. Why would Dan Rather lie about that? Why would the government sell that film to the Time Life Corporation, who locked it up for 50 years so nobody could see it? There's a second video called the Nix video, which was seized by the government. The Nix family is still in litigation trying to get a copy of that. It would tell us more that we don't know. I believe, based on my research, that there are multiple shooters. That explains Kennedy being shot from the front and the back. Now that brings us to Lee Harvey Oswald. What does he say when he is brought out in public? He says, "I'm a patsy. I didn't shoot anyone." For those of you familiar with firearms, Oswald has no nitrate. There are no powder burns on his chest or his arms, according to the test conducted by the Dallas police. If he had fired a leaky $29 Italian World War II vintage carbine, he'd have been covered with powder burns. There were none. He's exactly what he says he is. He's been maneuvered into place to be the fall guy. I don't believe that he's even on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. The time sequence, based on the recording from a motorcycle officer from the Dallas Police Department who had left his microphone on, gives us the exact time sequence of the shots. Would have been impossible for Oswald, who was not that great a marksman, he had the lowest rating from the Marine Corps, to get off 3 bullets that hit John Kennedy all from behind, hide the weapon, run down from the 6th floor to the 2nd floor, where he was casually seen eating his lunch by a Dallas police officer minutes after Kennedy had been shot. More importantly, a woman, I believe her name is Victoria Hill, was on the wooden staircase in the Texas School Book Depository building between floors 6 and 2, and she never sees, nor more importantly, does she hear Lee Harvey Oswald. We also know that on the cardboard boxes, the so-called crow's nest, are found the fingerprints of a man named Malcolm Mac Wallace. How do we know these are his fingerprints? Well, because in 1951, Mr. Wallace, who was an Agriculture Department employee hired at the behest of Lyndon Johnson, is convicted of first-degree murder when he shot and killed a man in Dallas who was involved in a love triangle with Lyndon Johnson's sister and was trying to blackmail Johnson with things that he had learned. It is notable that Wallace goes to trial in Dallas. He's represented by John Cofer, the same lawyer who represented Lyndon Johnson in the disputed 1948 Senate election. And he is convicted of first-degree murder. and he's the only man in the history of the state of Texas to get a suspended sentence for murder. He immediately goes to work for Temco, which was a defense contractor owned by D.H. Berg, an oil man who had another interesting property. He also owned the Texas School Book Depository building.
Anybody else amazed at how much he knows? I'm just,
Now, no fewer than 6 people say that they see a man in the window of the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building who meets the physical description of Mac Wallace. Medium build, middle age. They all say a man wearing spectacles. They all describe that he was wearing a tan jacket and light-colored pants. Of the 6, 3 also say there was a dark-complected man also seen on the 6th floor who was either Hispanic or perhaps Native American. That man comes forward. His name is Loy Factor. He is an expert shot. He's a Native American who had been recruited by Mac Wallace at a country fair about 2 years previous, where he saw some very fancy shooting. Factor has said that he was the backup shooter, that if Wallace had the shakes or lost his nerve, he was to step in and shoot some of the fatal shots. Kind of proving the point, because a lot of people have questioned this, Factor describes the physical scene, but interestingly he says because there was construction going on, there was a flat saw directly to the right of the window from which Kennedy was shot. There is no way for Factor to know that unless he was, of course, there. A man named James Carr, just a private citizen, sees a man meeting the description of Mac Wallace and a man meeting the description of Loy Factor run out of the Texas School Book Depository building minutes after Kennedy is shot, jump into a Nash Rambler driven by another dark-complected man, and is driven away. There are no fewer than 6 attempts on Mr. Carr's life after he reports this to the Dallas Police Department. There was also a man who I had an opportunity to interview for my book. He passed away shortly afterwards, named James Tague. James Tague was a young auto dealer. He was a supporter of President Kennedy. He went down to Dealey Plaza to try to get a glimpse of his hero. The traffic was so bad that he parked and abandoned his car, and he got close to Dealey Plaza. As the motorcade went by, a bullet hit the curb where he was standing, and a fleck of cement bounced up and grazed his cheek, and he was actually bleeding. There was a Dallas County Sheriff's officer saw this and said, we have to report this immediately, and took him to the Dallas Police Department. Tague was certain after he gave his report that they would contact him and ask him more about it, but he never heard another word. Then he saw on TV that the Warren Commission, or more precisely the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, who conducted their thorough investigation in all of 7 days and reached the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald had fired the 3 fatal shots all from behind, and the Warren Commission was essentially put together to rubber stamp the results of Hoover's investigation. So Tague was kind of perplexed. He went back to the spot where this had happened, and he noted that where the bullet had hit the cement curb had been entirely patched. There was no evidence of the bullet. He wrote this in his own book. He was in a bar. I think he had a few, and he was telling his story, and a reporter named James Lair from the McNear-Lair Report happened to be there, was then working for the AP, later became a famous television reporter. And the next day, this story was all over the newspapers that there was a 4th unidentified shot. This is what causes Arlen Specter, the chief investigator for the Warren Commission, to come up with the so-called single bullet theory, that the bullets fired, that bullet obviously no longer counts. The bullets fired hit both Kennedy and Connally. Connally, by the way, denied that to his grave, and the single bullet theory now has pretty much been demolished. I think there were probably as many as 4 shooters, one from the so-called grassy knoll. There are 2 witnesses who work for the railroad. They're in the railroad tower. They see a man drive up in the Plymouth station wagon, take a gun out of a rifle bag. They actually see him shoot. They see a puff of smoke. They told all of this to the Dallas police. Evidently, that information never made it to the Warren Commission, or perhaps it did. I also think that there is a shooter in the sewer grate. Johnny Roselli, who was a very well-known gangster, claims that he was that shooter. It's possible. I think the shooter on the grassy knoll on the fence line, where multiple people that day say they see a puff of smoke, is actually a Corsican imported by the mob specifically for the hit. Malcolm Wallace is the shooter from the 6th floor. So the CIA has their shooter, the mob has their shooter, Lyndon Johnson has their shooter. I think it's highly likely that there's also a shooter in the Dow Tex building, which is right next to the Texas School Book Depository building. So that kind of sets the scene. Now, if you listen to the recordings of Lyndon Johnson, the phone recordings, in which he's talking to Hoover after the murder, Hoover says, Mr. President, we've gotten intelligence that the Russians have conducted their own investigation into the Kennedy murder, and they have determined who did it. And Johnson said, really, who was it? And Hoover says, well, they say it was you. We also know that, and it's in her memoirs, Jacqueline Kennedy, who obviously had a great affinity for the French, had received a report from French intelligence. This book, Farewell to America, was actually published in book form, can still be found, also concluded that Lyndon Johnson was the perp. Now, interestingly enough, many of you may have seen the famous scene where Lyndon Johnson is sworn in on Air Force One. Jacqueline Kennedy, her dress still splattered with blood, is standing next to him. Note that broad grin on Lady Bird Johnson's face. She's very happy. The point, of course, is that there is no swearing-in ceremony, completely unnecessary. Upon the declaration of death by the president, the vice president is automatically president of the United States with full powers. So Johnson staged that for 2 reasons. First of all, he calls Robert Kennedy, who he despises, and he says, Bobby, I'm going to take the oath. Look up the oath for me. He's twisting the knife in Robert Kennedy. He also is seen famously winking at a Texas segregationist congressman who is a crony of his. And the judge who swears him in is a state judge who the Kennedys have refused to appoint to the federal bench. She is appointed to the federal bench shortly thereafter. So that scene is completely unnecessary. It is staged to give Johnson the imprimatur of Jacqueline Kennedy, who's clearly in shock. As I'm sure many of you have read, they ask her if she wants to change her clothes, and she says, no, I want them to see what they have done. Johnson's greatest fear was that Robert Kennedy would see through this. Indeed, Kennedy, who's the Attorney General, summonses John McCone, the head of the CIA, to his home in Hickory Hill outside of Washington and asks him point blank, did your guys do this? And McCone denies it. He's lying. It is absolutely fascinating that Johnson was able to really mobilize the FBI for a complete cover-up. One final coda, and then we'll go to your questions. Very recently, you may have seen that a Watergate tape which you've never heard of before, one of the White House tapes in the early days of the Watergate scandal, has recently been uncovered, and actually Tucker Carlson played it online after I wrote an article about it. It was covered also in Politico, where Richard Nixon is talking to Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, and he's essentially trying to pressure him, and he says, you know, things could get really bad here, speaking of Watergate. There's been a lot of dirty business over there that you know and I know needed to be done. And I've defended it when I've needed to, and God knows I've lied enough times to cover up for you boys. But if things get really bad, you can count on me. I mean, let me just put it to you this way. I know who shot John. There it is. Wow. Right there. That did get reported very recently by Fox and also by Politico.
Wow.
So motive, means, opportunity, fingerprint evidence, eyewitness evidence, deep Texas politics, I think explains my belief that Lyndon Johnson was at the helm of a conspiracy to murder John F. Kennedy. Everybody else involved has their own motive, as I have outlined. Each of them have a unique relationship with LBJ. What does it have to do with today? Well, several things. First of all, I honestly think that this is the beginning of the control of our government by an unelected elite. Dwight Eisenhower warned us about this. This is the military-industrial complex he warned us about. You can call it the deep state, you can call it whatever you want, but there is in our government and in private industry, those embedded in the intelligence agencies, those embedded in the State Department, those embedded in our law enforcement agencies, those in the think tanks, those in the defense industry that are a permanent establishment. And they had multiple motives, which I've laid out tonight, for the murder of John Kennedy. I also think they are responsible for taking Richard Nixon down in the silent coup of Watergate. Very recently, documents have been declassified that tell us that not only did the Central Intelligence Agency know about the plan to break into the Watergate, but they had infiltrated the burglar team. At least 4 of the 8 Watergate burglars are still on the payroll of the CIA, reporting to their handlers. And are you ready for this, folks? 4 of them are on the ground in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963.
Wow.
E. Howard Hunt, the famous CIA operative, the most famous of the Watergate burglars, says on his deathbed that yes, he was on the ground in Dallas, but he says, I was a backbencher because LBJ was running the show. This was told to me by St. John Hunt, his son, who he and I co-authored a book called The Bush Crime Family. You might want to check that out as well.
You got one on the Clintons too, right?
I did. So, look, I also think in this same unelected elite, the same deep state, which is what we call them today, are responsible not only for the removal of Nixon, but also for the attempted assassination of President Ronald Reagan. My next book will be about that attempted assassination. Let me just tell you quickly what I've learned. John Hinckley was convicted of the attempted murder of John F. Kennedy. He fired 4 bullets. He was in a crouching position, so he shot from below. All 4 of those bullets are accounted for, but none of them hit Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was hit from behind and above. Judy Woodruff, then with NBC, reported seeing a man on a balcony above the entrance of the Hilton Hotel, who she said appeared to be holding a weapon. When Reagan is rushed to George Washington University Hospital, first of all, there's something interesting. James Brady, his press secretary, who I knew well, who was shot in the head, got to GW Hospital 15 minutes before the President of the United States, which means that there was, according to my sources, an argument among the Secret Service whether to take Reagan to Bethesda Medical Center or George Washington Hospital. The hospital at GW was closer. That's where he ultimately went. When he got there, they had detected an entry and blood. He was spitting up blood, but the x-rays revealed no bullet. They could find no bullet in Reagan. They were preparing to sew him back up, which would have sealed his fate. And finally, one of the surgeons said, "This doesn't seem right." They opened him up a bit wider. The doctor actually put his hand inside Reagan's cavity, and he came up with a projectile the size of a dime, which is called a flechette. If you ever watch the church committee hearings, there's a full explanation of the weapon that is used to fire the flechette. It is noiseless. It is lethal. It is often coated with poison. It was designed specifically for the purposes of assassination. So the results of the results of the Reagan assassination have never been made public. But the backdrop was that there was a fight going on between Secretary of State Alexander Haig and Vice President George H.W. Bush over who would control government in the event of an emergency. There was a document on Reagan's desk which he had not signed prior to the assassination attempt. John Hinckley Sr. Is not only a friend of the Bush family, but as I have now learned, Zapata Oil, which is long thought to be a CIA front, bailed out Hinckley's Vanderbilt Energy 10 years before. So there's a close relationship between the Hinkleys and the Bushes. I've just given you kind of the top lines there. This will be my next book. And then, of course, they tried to remove Reagan under Iran-Contra, which was really run by Vice President George Bush. I really don't believe Reagan knew about the idea of trading arms for hostages. He said he didn't. Actually, he took responsibility, but he said he was not informed. These are the same people who pulled the Russian collusion hoax. They're the same people who staged the two phony Ukrainian impeachments. This is the deep state. They right now have one very important imperative: to stop Donald J. Trump from returning to office and cleaning house.
Yeah. There's nothing new under the sun. It's the same operation, which is why I would encourage everybody tonight. By the way, I don't know if you all think the way I think, but listening to Roger talk about U.S. history, I like history. I don't know if anybody else likes history, but my goodness, Roger. I mean, not only does Roger know U.S. history, but Roger has helped shape United States history over the last 50 years or so. And so this is a book that is available that Roger is going to sign tonight. And we want to make sure we buy all of these because he has come all the way from Florida to be here. And now we're going to take some questions, and they can be about anything. They can be about, and I'm going to tell you how we're going to do them. Because we have an online audience tonight. There's going to be some ushers that are going to be up at the front, and we'll form a line. And we can go lines there and lines there through kind of the openings. And John, if you want to send the ushers forward with the microphones, and we're just going to take some questions. They can be about JFK. They can be about anything that you would like. You can ask about the election that is coming up. It's kind of like, this is your moment. Ask Roger Stone anything. And we'll just form, come on down, and we'll just form some lines. This is not super organized or anything like that, but here is what I will say. I get to be the bad guy in this moment. Nobody is going to give speeches right now. Nobody's going to give statements right now. You can ask a question, and Mr. Stone will do his best to answer that question. So we'll start right over here. And sir, what is your question for Mr. Stone?
It's been 60 years since the assassination of Kennedy. What's the current status of the release of all the documents related to that assassination?
Excellent question. In 1978, the U.S. Congress, based on the results of a special congressional investigation by the House Select Committee on Assassination passed the Kennedy Assassination Documents Act, which mandated that all of the material would be declassified in 2017. Shortly after Donald Trump became president, I asked him in a phone conversation what he intended to do. He was unaware that this deadline was upon him. Nobody had told him that. He was a little surprised. He asked me if I was sure. I said, yes, I was positive. He said, well, what do you think I should do? I said, I think you should release everything. I mean, it's been 60 years. Nobody involved is still alive. I think the American people have the right to know what happened. In the end, he released about 80% of the classified material. We learned a number of interesting things. For example, we found Lyndon Johnson's application and membership card in the Ku Klux Klan. That was in the files. We found the W-9 and the 1099 for Lee Harvey Oswald when he worked for the FBI. We found a number of interesting things, but in the end, Trump told me that Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, had convinced him to withhold about 20% of the documents because he said that they would reveal the sources and methods of the CIA. To me, I think the sources are all dead, and if the government was involved in the murder of a president, we should know that.
Yeah.
We should know that. Trump has subsequently said that if he's elected president again, he will now release everything. Having not released it in 2017, the next date fell under Joe Biden. Biden also released a little bit, but still held back about half of the remaining 20%. What is it? They don't want to know. I think what you end up with is definitive proof of the Central Intelligence Agency's role in the murder of Kennedy. That's my working theory.
It's a good answer. Question right over here.
My question is twofold. Do you feel like we can clean this up and get our country back and get them completely out? And my biggest fear is the safety of President Trump.
Well, first of all, I believe Jesus Christ can do anything.
Amen.
I mean, I just don't believe that the good Lord is going to let this last best beacon of freedom in the world perish. We have not come all this way for this. We just have not. It is going to take divine intervention because I really don't think that what we're facing today is a struggle between Democrats and Republicans or liberals and conservatives. It's far more than that. It is nothing less than a struggle between good and evil.
Yeah.
Between dark and light, between the godly and the godless. And if we fail, America will step off into 1,000 years of darkness. But we already see the hand of God. This case in Georgia is falling apart.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court has agreed to hear things I didn't think they would be willing to hear. Now, I'm not saying that there are not many obstacles. There are. But I think they will fall away. So yes, I'm confident. I have great confidence that things are going to work out. We're going to reclaim our Constitution. None of this would be possible without the innate toughness of Donald J. Trump. Look, I worked for Nixon, who's a very tough guy. This guy lost the presidency by a hair. He went on to lose the governorship of California in a major embarrassment. He was done, finished, completely ruined. He was a national punchline. But the Vietnam War, the murder of John Kennedy, the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, the murder of Robert Kennedy parted the seas in a way that allowed for his political comeback. That required enormous toughness and enormous discipline. I worked for Senator Bob Dole, who's one of the greatest men of the 20th century. He would have been a truly great president. He was hit by a shell in Italy during World War II. He was told that he would never walk again, that he would never have the use of his limbs or his hands again, that he would be bedridden for the rest of his life. He refused to accept that. He nursed himself back using weights and pulleys to the full use of his legs and one of his arms. He had as some people know, he had a withered and unusable arm. He was a true American hero. I was his assistant for 2 years in the Senate. He was tough as nails. Both those guys were tough guys. Neither one of them is even remotely as tough as Donald Trump.
Go right over here.
Question sort of builds off that, but Trump is more the wiser now with all the stuff that's gone on, knowing about the deep state and the stuff you have revealed, I'm sure he's aware of. What is being done to vet the people that surround him so that he's protected from this kind of shenanigans?
It's something that I pray about constantly. I would urge all of you to pray for the safety of the president and his family. It is a legitimate concern of mine. The Secret Service agents who work for him or are assigned to him seem devoted to him. On the other hand, you never know what Satan is up to. It is a very legitimate concern. But to the first part of your question, he's very keenly aware now of the divisions in American politics and who is it that tried to destroy his presidency and who is it that denied him a second term that I, among others, believe he actually won.
You don't think Biden got 81 million?
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but I do not. And therefore, I think as great a president as he was in his first term, and he was a great president. I mean, he gave us the most robust economy in American history. The greatest rate of job growth, the greatest rate of wage growth, the lowest levels of unemployment among all Americans, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, young, old, urban, rural. He changed the tax laws to bring billions of dollars back into the country to expand businesses here and create businesses here. He rebuilt our military strength. He appointed dozens and dozens and dozens of conservatives to the federal bench. The Russians would not have ever moved on Ukraine if Donald Trump were president. The Chinese wouldn't dare move on Taiwan if Donald Trump was president. But as great as he was in his first term, he will be an even greater president in his second term.
Hi, I am curious, the last time there was a massive deportation, I believe, was Mr. President Dwight Eisenhower. And I'm curious if we are going to be able to do that again, because President Trump said he's going to have, the largest deportation, so we can try to get our country back and rebuild our healthcare systems and our schools and treat our veterans much better and spend our money more wisely. And I'm curious, is it plausible to make that happen again?
Well, I mean, if Dwight Eisenhower could deport 1.3 million illegals in 1953, I see no reason why we cannot deport millions of illegals today. All one needs to have is the will and the authority. What I don't understand is this effort in the U.S. Senate by your senator, Senator Langford, and Chuck Schumer to pass a border security bill that allows 5,000 illegals in the country per week. That's 155,000 per month. That's 1.8 million a year. That's not a border security bill. That's an open borders bill.
Hey, I have an idea. I think I'm going to go on tour throughout the state of Oklahoma, and the tour is going to be called I Told You So. We'll come right over here.
A little change of subject. I'm wondering why the government is so adamant about electric vehicles when they are so polluting to our environment, when you try to get the cobalt and the lithium out of the mines and to destroy the environment, and then the batteries don't last if they don't burn your house down. And CNG is the cleanest vehicle on the planet. Why can't we have $1.5 trillion of infrastructure and have a little bit more than zero for CNG infrastructure?
The only conclusion one can reach is that all of these policies, whether they're open borders or whether it is destroying the gasoline engine automotive industry, these are designed to destroy the country. These aren't like well-meaning but naive liberals who are just mistaken. The result of their policies requiring everybody in the military to take the COVID-19 shot when it has never been through clinical trials, when the manufacturers of it have no legal liability, this effort to push gender and racial lies in the public schools, these are not well-meaning but misguided liberals. These people seek to destroy our country. The Democratic Party of John Kennedy, the Democratic Party of Harry Truman, there was a time in America the Democratic Party was just as anti-communist as the Republican Party, where both parties believed in capitalism and free enterprise. Yeah, the Democrats wanted to spend more, they wanted to tax more, but they still loved America. John Kennedy loved America. That Democratic Party literally no longer exists. It's been taken over by a radical Marxist clique, and they intend to destroy this country unless they lose the next presidential election.
Yeah, it's good. Come over here.
I would like to know what was said to the security members to remove them from the area before the assassination of Kennedy.
I'm not sure I understood. Could you repeat your question?
I would like to know what was said to the Secret Service members to remove them from the area before the assassination of Kennedy.
It's hard to say. If you go on YouTube, though, you can see a video. There were supposed to be 2 Secret Service agents riding on the rear bumper. You can see them being ordered by their superior to stand down. One of them shrugs his shoulders because that's not consistent with the Secret Service protocol. So there are too many violations of the Secret Service protocol that day. A woman whose name is Madeline Brown, who was Lyndon Johnson's mistress, who bore Johnson a son who looks exactly like Lyndon Johnson. You can look his photo up tonight. It's online.
What's his name?
His name is Stephen Brown. She has said in numerous interviews, which can be found on YouTube, that she spent the night with Johnson in the Fort Worth hotel the night before, and that he told her the night before and the morning of the assassination, after tomorrow, I won't have to put up with those Irish sons of bitches anymore. Now, interestingly, one of those interviews with Madeline Brown was conducted by Geraldo Rivera. And about 15 years ago, I met Geraldo Rivera in a green room at Fox, and I told him that I had seen this groundbreaking interview with Madeline Brown. It was one of the things that had given me the gumption to write this book, and he said, "Who's Madeline Brown?" And I said, "You know, Lyndon Johnson's mistress." He said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he went and locked himself in the men's room.
Come right over here.
Can I go in a different direction? Do you have any information on Bush Sr.'s funeral, what was in the envelopes?
I do not. So George Bush's connection to the Kennedy assassination is interesting. I'm among those who think it is not as nefarious. It's questionable, but not as nefarious as it appears. It can be established that George H.W. Bush says for 30 years after the assassination that he simply doesn't remember where he was that day. Now, anyone who was of age when Kennedy was killed knows exactly where they were when they heard that. But it can also be established that Bush was speaking in Tyler, Texas, at a Chamber of Commerce luncheon because he had just was preparing to announce a 1964 bid for the U.S. Senate, a race that he would lose. But it is also known that Bush, within minutes of Kennedy being shot and becoming made public, calls the FBI headquarters in Houston and says, "This is George Bush. I'm in Tyler, Texas. I felt you should know there's a young man who's in the Young Republican Club in Harris County, which is Houston. who may or may not have made threats against the president. I've heard this, but I haven't heard it firsthand. You might want to check it out. By the way, did I mention that I'm in Tyler, Texas? So I think he's establishing an alibi. There's a very famous tape, Watergate tape, where Nixon is talking to Henry Kissinger. And they're talking about an extremely sensitive diplomatic mission. And they're trying to figure out who to send. And Nixon says to Kissinger, well, Henry, we could send George Bush. And Kissinger says, no, Mr. President, he would only fuck it up.
We'll come over here. We're going to pray later tonight, Roger.
Well, I wanted to be historically faithful.
Hopefully you'll answer both of these, but one, what did you find out about Jack Ruby? And two, are you going to write a book on the Clintons?
I have written a book on the Clintons. It's probably what got me indicted. It's called The Clintons' War on Women. It is a complete compendium of the epic crime of Bill and Hillary Clinton, including his serial sexual assaults and rapes on as many as 38 women. I interviewed many of them. I also go into his illegitimate African-American son, Danny Williams, who is still alive. I go into the scandal in the Arkansas prison system where they were selling blood that was drained from the prisoners abroad without screening it for HIV. The massive crimes of the Clinton Foundation. The longest chapter in the book is about a guy named Jeffrey Epstein. This was published in 2015, and it got no mainstream media coverage at all. But the airplane manifests are in there, who visited it's all there. That book can be bought at stonezone.com in the store. You also get an autographed copy of that. It's called The Clintons' War on Women. What was the first part of your question? Remind me again.
What did you find out about Jack Ruby?
So, interestingly enough, Jack Ruby, this is a kind of a secondary part of the Nixon story I told you at the beginning. Nick Ruey, who was Nixon's traveling aide, was a friend of mine, told me that the day that Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald on national television, Nixon was scheduled to go out to New Jersey to have lunch with Mary Roebling, who came from a very wealthy New Jersey family who built the George Washington Bridge. And Mary Roebling was a major donor and supporter of Nixon's. And Ruey showed up at Nixon's apartment on Park Avenue. Nixon was watching TV, and he saw, as all Americans did, Jack Ruby blow away Lee Harvey Oswald on national television. Nixon sat bolt upright and said, I know that man. I know that man. And Ruey said, sir? He said, that's Rubenstein. That's Rubenstein. Murray Schottner brought him to me. And when you research this, what you find is that Jack Rubenstein, Jack Ruby, had been on the payroll of the House Un-American Activities Committee as an informant because Congressman Lyndon Johnson realized that Congressman Richard Nixon had leftover budget money, and Murray Schottner, who was an early advisor, probably the first modern political consultant, who had orchestrated Nixon's rise in politics, was also a mob lawyer, and he had brought Rubenstein to Nixon for an interview, and Nixon had put Jack Ruby on the House payroll. I produce in my book the actual U.S. House of Representatives documents that prove that Jack Ruby was on the House payroll. Now, the Warren Commission told us that Jack Ruby had no known associations with organized crime, which is laughable because he ran a casino in Cuba for Carlos Marcello, and he'd been a button man for the mob in Chicago when he went by the name of Rubenstein. I think Jack Ruby was murdered. There is a very famous video, you can find it on YouTube, and Ruby is being led by a couple of Texas Rangers. He's wearing handcuffs, they're pulling him down a hallway. And the reporters are yelling, Jack, Jack, how could this happen? And Ruby says, look at the man at the top, the man at the very top. And they said, Jack, what are you saying? And Ruby says, let me put it this way. If Adlai Stevenson were vice president, this never would have happened. You can go see it on YouTube. It's still there.
Wow. Wow. All right. We're going to take one final question right here, and then Mr. Stone will be out in the lobby to shake your hand, sign some books, and so we're going to take one final question. Go ahead.
Okay. I don't know where to begin, seriously. Thank you, first of all. Do you see a convergence? I'm talking about going forward because I simply am just overwhelmed with all this information you've given us, so thank you again. But do you see a convergence between the Democratic wing that existed, the patriotic wing that existed of the Democratic Party as represented by JFK, and the populist MAGA wing of the Republican Party joining forces, as Pastor Lohmeyer here representing, I think, that, but the fact that you're actually, you were brought here to talk about a Democrat icon, do you see a convergence going forward in which could save this country or at least put it back on this right path?
Well, but we've already seen it. This is why Donald Trump won and Mitt Romney did not. Go look at the cities of Detroit and Milwaukee and Atlanta. You see two different phenomena. First of all, Trump gets an incrementally larger group of African American votes in 2016. He's going to do much better there this time. But also among blue-collar, white, union member Democrats, the kind of Democrats who own guns, who are supporters of the Second Amendment, those are we used to call them Reagan Democrats. Today we can call them Trump Democrats. That is the new coalition. That's why he's ahead in the polls today. That is the coalition that needs to be reassembled. It's the America First coalition. So we will lose some of the Cheney, Bush, Langford, country club Republicans, but we will make up for it in working class Democrats, Hispanic voters, where we're now hitting, record numbers in the polling, and African Americans who I think realize that this invasion of the country by illegals is keeping them from economic opportunity and jobs. So I think that coalition's coming together even as we speak.
Final question from me. You think we can win in 2024?
There's no question whatsoever that we can win. I would go one step further and to say, with the prayers of everyone in this room, we will win.
Well, you thank Mr. Roger Stone tonight for coming to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Thank you, sir. Roger will be out in the lobby. Stay here for just a second. I want to bring two people up real quickly, Clay Clark and John Bennett. John, if you'll come up here. Roger, you can make your way out.